Hi everyone, welcome to the first of Extolla's Shift Happens series. We are delighted to have Jim Barnes, the CEO of enVista, today here to speak to us about supply chain technologies. Now, I could try to introduce Jim, but I think it is way better for him to have a chance to introduce himself and take us through his decades long, I don't think he'll mind me saying that, career that he has had in supply chain around the world. Before we let Jim introduce himself, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Claire Bull. I'm the Director of Technology and Sustainability at Extolla. And we're so excited to have you here for the first of three-part webinar series. So without further ado, Jim, love for you to just give us a little bit of background about yourself and your career. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thanks to the to Extolla as well. So I'm very excited about the opportunity to speak to the audience regarding just supply chain technology in general. But my background is very simple. I'm an engineer by trade. I've been doing supply chain technology around specifically around warehouse management, transportation, order management, labor management. Really, we kind of coined this as supply chain execution and also planning for 30 years, and I cannot believe I've been in this business for 30 years. But yeah, my background is, as you mentioned earlier, is really around supply chain technology, selecting, deploying, implementing. I've done probably over 100 different customers over my career, and probably 300 to 400 different warehousing distribution sites over that 30-year lustrous career of mine. So I know a little bit about the space.
Yeah, amazing. I think you can officially call yourself an expert now.
Thank you.
uh, and so I guess then over the last 20 years or so, how have you seen that approach to technology selection change across businesses? What's been the really big shift in the last couple of decades at how businesses go out and source and find and select the technologies that they put into their supply chain?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if there's been a lot that's changed in terms of the way you select software. I think what we're doing is we're getting better in terms of the process itself, but there are specific requirements that, regardless of what you're selecting, are I call them truisms, and those truisms are going through understanding process scope. When I say process scope, really requirements, like what are your functional and technical requirements at the user level. The same thing would apply at a technical scope, an integration scope. And obviously, the big one is financial scope in terms of building that total cost of ownership over a 5 year to 7 year time period. But the devil's in the detail as it relates to understanding the requirements for your business and then conveying those requirements to any software provider, regardless of what type of piece of technology you're actually selecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that businesses are really understanding and thinking about what their state is now and then what their future state might be? So, how important is it, and how far into the future do you think businesses should be planning for when they're selecting technologies?
Well, I think the farther out you can go, the best. But in terms of today's age, in terms of way that technology is built, specifically as we move from on-prem software, which I think is really, really key, on-prem software to a true cloud native. And I didn't say SaaS, software as a service, which I think people get confused. Software as a service is how I pay for the software, but not the
Mhm.
actual architecture of the software. So as we move from on-prem to truly cloud native, that's composable, that's using microservices, that's really different. So understanding that really the architecture of where we were, just 5, 7 years ago to compared to where we are today has drastically changed. So unwrapping that and understanding how that provider has built their product and that architecture is super, super critical to selecting a piece of software.
Yeah, absolutely, because we have seen a massive shift between on-prem and cloud, in this market as well as in the US. And then, in your view, are companies giving enough weight and understanding to the integration capability of what software they're choosing now, and how much weight do they need to give that?
No, it's a great question, and I'll break it down this way. Look, anytime you are buying, let's say, a best of breed, which is different than buying a ERP that has additional functionality or expanded functionality. For example, Microsoft may have a warehouse management system, or SAP may have a different transportation planning tool. But if you're buying a best of breed piece of software that's focused on a specific need of the business, understanding the level of integration and the capability of the software company, but also understanding your integration capabilities as well. So if you're going to use an enterprise service bus to do the messaging and build what we call canonical data models, is extremely important. But really, what standard APIs, and I will tell you because obviously I've sold software, we've built software, we have deployed software. Everybody will tell you they've got a ton of APIs, right? Application program interfaces that are built primarily on REST type technology. But understanding those APIs and how those APIs are being used and how flexible those APIs are, and also the level of extensibility of the software is mission critical. So integration is definitely a key. And I would ask the question of, well, what do your APIs look like? Do you manage API governance or not? Or do you have API governance? And how many APIs do you actually have today? And show me an example of what an API looks like and how it actually works. So how do I take data and move it from a legacy application to, let's say, a cloud native application? What does that look like? And so unwinding and unwrapping that integration is very mission critical to understand what you're getting, or quite frankly, what you're not getting. Followed by, which I think is very important, is who's going to do the integration. Just because a software company says I've got 1,000 REST APIs doesn't mean that it's plug and play. So somebody's
Yeah.
got to build those integrations between point to point, and that comes with a cost.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to your earlier point. The devil is in the detail, and what people say and what they can actually deliver is really important just to make sure you evaluate. And so, if we're thinking about it like from the other side and you were evaluating software vendors and software for your business, what are some of the red flags that businesses should watch for? Like, what are some of the unfortunate stories that you've come across that you think you'd like to share so businesses can avoid making that same mistake?
Oh, where to start? I've probably made more mistakes than I've been successful in my life, but or even deploying software because it can be complex. Look, the biggest red flag is understanding. Let me take a step back. I always tell people jokingly, it's called software for a reason, right? It's not called hardware. It's called software, right? So you can really make it do what you want it to actually achieve in terms of getting to a business outcome. The key is really picking. I think the red flag is picking the right partner, right? Understanding what that partner's capabilities are, the level of R&D they spend on the actual software, what is their long-term vision for the software, followed by making sure that you do solid reference checks as well. Understand that if the software company is smart, they're not going to give you a bad reference, right? And I hope they don't give you a neutral reference. I hope they give you a great reference. But you need to take the time to really understand how that software company is going to partner with you long term. And so when
Yeah.
the tough gets going, right, do they come to the dance or not with you?
Yeah.
And are they truly just there to sell your license and get in and get out? Are they really
Hmm.
there for the long term? Followed by, I think, another red flag is who's doing the implementation. So is a software company just selling you a license and a third party provider is going to do the implementation on their behalf? Or are they going to do it, or is there a hybrid approach? So understanding who has, as we like to say in the United States, right, where does the buck stop, right? Does the buck
Yeah.
stop with a software vendor, a third-party integrator, or a combination of both, and understanding who ultimately is responsible for the deployment of that software?
Yeah, absolutely. That is great advice, and we see that happening often here. Another question I wanted to ask you about, and interesting to hear a US perspective. Um, and we don't want to go into politics, but ESG space is becoming more prominent in this region, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. We've got carbon emission mandatory reporting legislation that's come in. Have you seen anything in the sustainability ESG space actually affect decision making around software and technology purchases?
When I saw your question on this, Claire, I don't really have a clear answer. I think that other countries, not including our administration, are really less focused on our climate and sustainability. Where I think countries like Australia, New Zealand, specific European countries are much more focused on it. The United States, right or wrong, is not highly focused on this. It's not to say that software companies are not marketing it, but I don't think buyers today are making a decision between software A and software B because they've got more sustainability functionality as it relates to ESG.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. No, no. And I mean, that's great to know. And what I really wanted to hear from you, and I think we had a chat before this webinar about sharing the ungoogleable stuff that I can't just find on ChatGPT. And you've got all the experience in the industry, and so I want to understand: are there any particular technologies that you're seeing either in the North American market or anywhere around the world that you're just really excited about? Businesses that are at the front of the pack doing everything right, that you're just looking at and saying, those folks are winning. What businesses are you excited about in this space?
Yeah, so let me give you some context. So where I think, and this is specific to the United States, as we see labor shortages, as we see wage rates increase, minimum wage, there's a big emphasis here in the United States on automation and robotics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and your traditional warehouse management system and even your traditional warehouse execution software that we deploy to run the automation is changing. I'll
Yeah.
throw out a new term that I'm really excited about. It's either warehouse orchestration system or warehouse optimization systems that are
Mm-hmm.
really starting to take foothold in the United States as we are starting to manage multiple what I call subsystems within inside a distribution center. Now, let's define a subsystem. A subsystem could be a good to person system, let's say a Geek Plus or a High Robotics. A subsystem could be an autonomous robot that could be by Auto or Gray Orange, as an example. But it's the construct of warehouse orchestration, which I'll define, and then what we call the whole concept of interoperability. So when I have multiple subsystems and multiple robots, how do I communicate to them and ensure that they play nice together? And so
Yeah.
if I've got an auto robot or an auto AGV playing with, let's say, a Baleo forklift, how do I make sure that they don't run into each other, right? That's the construct of interoperability to ensure that they can play nice together. And so there's contention who has right of way. Um,
Yeah.
and on the orchestration side, what we're seeing is the need to take order flow, right, around SLA, regardless of channel, retail or direct to consumer, and understanding how do orders really flow. And the key word is how, not what or why, but how do I orchestrate these subsystems to get to a business outcome? That could
Mm-hmm.
be somebody managing the process manually. That could be a subsystem like an ASRS or a GTP system, aka shuttle. That could be a good to person, let's call it a mobile storage unit that's coming back to me. But how do I orchestrate the flow to ensure that I meet the operational throughput and the SLAs? Now, I say this, why? because warehouse management systems in this space are really, it's kind of a misnomer. Warehouse management systems are really tasking engines. They're really not managing dynamically how work gets done. I have a batch of work, I release it in this example, Claire, and then I hope and pray that somehow it all gets out the door. And the way I manage it, right or wrong, is through reporting and analytics. But nothing is dynamic, right? Nothing's telling me that the system is behaving based upon an SLA that I'm trying to meet. And so this, what I'm excited about is this new breed of software that's doing planning and execution real time in warehouse distribution environments. Now, where does this come from? Well, the construct actually comes from manufacturing. This isn't new. It's just new to warehousing, but manufacturers have been doing this for quite some time, right? With advanced planning and scheduling systems in manufacturing work cells to make a product. Same construct, but now being applied to warehousing finally, that we're starting to plan and execute how work gets done within the four walls. So that's what's got me excited right now.
Absolutely. And so that just makes it more relevant, your earlier point before about looking at the total supply chain end to end rather than just focusing on little individual pieces when you're selecting technology, because you really do need to understand the flow of inventory from the second it gets in the door to pretty much when it gets to the customer's house.
Well, and I think today as we move into more automated, again, I'm specifically around supply chain execution, where AKA WMS for a distribution right shed in your and using your guys' local speak, right? But if you look at it, I don't need this piece of technology if it's manual. I can rely on a warehouse management system, maybe with some type of analytics powered by, there are ways to use AI in this environment, but the reality is I'm really speaking about more highly automated facilities where I'm processing hundreds of thousands of lines, or orders, and I'm really kind of lights out, right? I don't have a lot of people in the building. We are not yet there with a humanless, or like I call it non-human DC, but that's really not that far off, right? I could see that in the next 5 years where I walk in with really no humans at all, with the exception of engineers and technologists working on the systems, but really there are no humans in the building at all. We're not that far away from that happening.
And you mentioned a word that I don't think we could go through any 2025 webinar without mentioning, which is AI.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of talk about AI, and we're starting to use it for small tasks in our day-to-day business life. But have you actually seen AI used in supply chain situations? And can you give us any examples, or is it all just talk at the moment?
Well, no, I mean, there is a lot of marketing hype, right, around AI, no doubt. It seems to be the latest and greatest buzzword. And especially if we're using things like uh, natural processing languages like GPT. But as it relates to supply chain, there's really two uses that we see today. One is around inventory optimization. And so looking at demand planning and forecasting engines that are using AI and predictive analytics of where to position inventory in a network to fulfill the demand, right? That's first, and that's real, that's happening. There's folks out there like Impact Analytics, Tools Group, uh, to name a few, that are really using AI to drive inventory planning and positioning. And then within the four walls of a DC, we're using AI around that orchestration engine. So when I drop orders that need to be processed, retail, wholesale, or even direct to consumer orders, evaluating patterns by using algorithms specifically around machine learning that's understanding what those patterns look like. So I can then allocate how work gets done. And so we're definitely seeing practical uses around AI around those particular supply chain areas within the United States, and those are real. Like we're using those today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, we're hoping to see more and more of that here. So it's great to hear that you're already seeing it happening in practice. I want to just go back to something you were talking about earlier, which is around the whole idea of understanding how the business works and how orders move through. Often it's actually the frontline users and staff within the business that understand that. So, at what stage in the process is it important to involve frontline operations in deciding which technology to use in a business?
Great question. Let me take a step back, right? So I think it's really important when you do any type of system selection on a piece of technology. Let's again, I'll just use a warehouse management system or a transportation management system. But let's assume we're using a WMS. It's important to document your as-is processes. Who knows those as-is processes are what we do our three actuals, which means I'm going to go see the actual place. I'm going to document the actual process and keyword, right? I'm going to speak to the actual people that do the work, right? What a novel concept. The people that do the actual work, I want to spend as much time with because I want to understand my baseline. Now, here's a challenge. Those same associates may not understand the future, but they definitely understand the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
They understand why they're not efficient and why they're not effective. They may not have the understanding about what the future looks 5 years, but they truly understand the problem. And so as you
Yeah.
start to select a piece of technology, having those users engaged, I think, is mission critical because you can start using it as a way to educate them on the future. And you can take change management, or I to use transition management, right? Type strategies, is that you cannot change behaviors until you're willing to let go of the end. But that doesn't
Yeah.
start with the future. That starts with the business problem that you're trying to actually solve. So I truly do like to bring in the associates, right, of the business up front and to get their buy-in and their support because ultimately without them, the piece of technology isn't going to work if you don't have that upfront buy-in, Claire.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And so then thinking about the time where you have selected a technology and we're looking at the implementation phase, just want to talk through kind of what are the key steps to set that implementation phase up for success after you have selected.
Yeah, so I think when you start doing a system selection, I like to consider it as phase zero, right? It's not phase one, it's not phase two, it's not phase three. It's really the selection is a phase zero. You're trying to get alignment around multiple business unit operators. That could be your information technology team from CTO down to VP of architecture. That's getting your functional users engaged. That's getting your human resource people engaged as well, because there can be impact to your human capital and your human associates. That's getting your finance team. They could also be getting in your buyers and planners if you're retail centric. So I think the more cross functional you bring in the organization at phase zero, then you have
Mm-hmm.
more clarity around the outcome of what you're trying to achieve. Now, when we go through a deployment of an implementation, I tell people that it's a three-legged stool. And people like to cheat, right? So it takes right or wrong, this is my engineering in me, right? To create a
Mm-hmm.
plane and a stable table, you have to have 3 points. Okay? If not, you start to have a wobbly table. But those 3 points are really good design. You need
Mm-hmm.
solution architects that understand the interdependency between all the systems and subsystems, especially if it's more automated up front, that understand how these systems are going to work together in concert. So
Mm-hmm.
design and defining those design requirements, both functionally and technically, through a functional specification document and a detailed integration document is mission critical. Followed by, obviously, the easy part is configuration of the system itself. And then the second portion is testing. We are big proponents of using automated test scripts through different third parties pieces of software to do not only regression testing, integration testing, but testing from the UX, UI, all the way through the database. So the more test libraries we create, the more testing that we do end to end, we can then start to mitigate our risk before we go live. And that's the second part. And the third part, quite frankly, is probably the part where people try to save on and they try to actually skimp, for lack of better terms, is really
Hmm.
around training and development and change management. And
Yeah.
so the need to train in users and super users up front and to bring them along the ride is mission critical. So again, design, testing,
Yeah.
and training, those three steps or three phases need to be balanced. If they're not in balance, then you put the actual project go live at risk, Claire.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you've made that point a couple of times now. You've got to get buy-in from people in the business because that is what is going to create success of that implementation and that technology working. Um, I just wanted to touch on pilots and proof of concept. Have you seen that work well? Do you recommend doing pilots?
It's interesting, right? I think yes and no, right? So I think it depends upon what you're trying to accomplish. So I mean, I always tell people, look, do you want the 5 day answer? You want the 5 week answer, or you want the 5 month answer, right? And so if you want to move fast and with one vendor, you can do a proof of concept or a pilot with them just to prove out, are they capable of meeting your requirements? We like to do slightly different. Like we like to actually build a pretty comprehensive requirement document with different use cases for the actual software vendor. And we like to bake them off each, like to actually have them go head to head. So if you want to talk about proof of concept, you can do that, or proof of delivery. But we don't really go down to the proof of concepting level. We like to actually spend 2 or 3 days in kind of a conference room, baking every single requirement off, both functionally and technically, to ensure the software vendor can meet the requirements. And more importantly, not focusing on happy path, but
Hmm.
focusing on the complexity. We like to focus on exceptions versus the actual norm, right? And so it's
Yeah.
easy for a software vendor to meet the happy path, but we want to focus on the exceptions, which is really makes your business unique. So again, it's important to go through the 80%, but it's really more important to go through the 20% if we're using kind of that Pareto analysis thinking.
Yeah. And then kind of taking it back up again in the last couple of minutes, what industries or sectors do you think are setting the benchmark right now when it comes to innovative supply chain technology adoption?
Well, I think the big boys here in the United States, the Walmarts of the world, large grocery store chains where margins are thin in grocery, margins are thin in certain retail sectors. And so,
Hmm.
where you see margin compression and people are literally trying to squeeze out 1 US cent per case or 1 US cent per unit, you're
Yeah.
seeing that innovation because they're trying to drive additional margins to improve their overall contribution margins to the bottom line.
Hmm.
That's one area of focus because they have no choice, right? They have to be competitive. And so therefore they're trying to drive costs out of their supply chains. But specifically, we're seeing a lot of that in grocery retail and high volume retailers,
Yeah.
where you have enough volume to warrant the level of technology and the innovation. That's kind of what we're
Yeah.
seeing here in the United States.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, and then for our final question, because we've got 1 minute to go, what I've
Yeah.
heard from you today is a bit of a summary. Is it's super important to get everyone involved from what you're calling stage zero onwards, and that the devil is absolutely in the detail, and not necessarily believing what vendors and businesses say, but kind of getting in under the hood, so to speak. If there was one final piece of advice that you could give to supply chain leaders who are currently thinking about evaluating new technologies or putting new technologies into their supply chain, what would that be?
Yeah, I'd say take the time, right? Take the time to do the due diligence. Don't skimp on it because you are making an investment that is a minimum of 5 year, if not 10-year investment. So We're doing a project right now for actually a mid-sized grocery retailer here in the United States, and we've been at it for a year. Now, do you need to spend a year? The answer is no, but they are very risk adverse. They are on an old piece of technology. To unwind a legacy custom system takes a
Mhm.
lot of work and a lot of effort because there are a lot of moving parts. And it's been so highly customized for their business. The users are concerned about going backwards because they've been worth this piece of technology for 20 years. So it's been so highly tuned and it's made just for their business that that adoption is a concern by them. So again, does it require a year? The answer is no. But I would say take the time to understand what you're buying, who you're buying it from, and understand if this is a long term partner that you, quite frankly, want to be with for the next 5 year minimum to 10 years, right? So
Yeah.
it's I hate to say it, Claire, it's like a marriage, right? It can actually be worse because it's very expensive to get divorced, right? As we know. So you got to spend the time understanding who you're going to partner with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think thanks for sharing that example because I think that we could all really understand that scenario. Thank you so much, Jim. We have done our 30 minutes. It felt like five to me. I don't know about you, but
It went it
I
went it
really
went by very quickly, Claire. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your insights. And to everyone who's watched, you've all stayed the whole time. So I really appreciate that. And we've got our next series coming up later in May, which will be focusing on sustainability and carbon emissions. So hope to have you join us for that as well. Thank you so much, Jim. And I hope everyone else has a great rest of the day.
Take care.
Thank you.